Montana Territory, November 1878. The most respected builder in Bitterroot Valley said it was dangerous and useless. A waste of stone, a fire hazard, an invitation to disaster. But when the coldest winter in recorded memory arrived, every corner of that cabin stayed warm, while neighboring families huddled around dying fires in frozen rooms. Today you'll understand why the worst idea became the most copied heating system across 3 counties. If you want to discover one real frontier technique every week, methods that worked when life depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's see how many of us are spread across this cold world. Now, let me tell you about the chimney that changed everything. Winter 1877 taught Bitterroot Valley a brutal lesson. Standard cabins followed a simple rule: 1 fireplace, 1 chimney, stone or clay. Build it tall, keep it drawing, stack wood nearby. The heat stayed where the fire burned. If you wanted warmth, you sat close. The far corners? Cold. The sleeping loft? Freezing. Children woke with frost on their blankets. Women cooked with numb fingers. Samuel Bridger knew this problem intimately. He'd spent 4 winters in a regulation cabin, stone fireplace on the east wall, single flue rising 16 feet. His daughters slept in the northwest corner under piles of wool and bearskin. Every morning, ice crusted the inside of the log walls. His wife kept a second fire going in a makeshift outdoor kitchen because the main hearth couldn't reach the food prep area without smoking out the whole interior. Samuel wasn't a builder by trade. He was a contract logger, a man who spent his days felling ponderosa pine and Douglas fir on the steep ridges above the valley. But he'd watched enough cabins go up, seen enough families suffer through the cold months, measured enough firewood consumption to know something was fundamentally wrong with the accepted method. The standard approach was failing. Settlers burned cords upon cords of wood. Men spent half their daylight hours splitting, hauling, stacking. Fires demanded constant feeding. Let it die down for 2 hours during the night, and the far side of the cabin dropped below freezing. Moisture condensed on the cold logs. Mold crept into bedding. Respiratory illnesses swept through families every January. Samuel did the math. His neighbor, Dutch Kerner, burned through approximately 9 cords of firewood each winter to keep a 20 by 24-foot cabin marginally habitable. That's roughly 1,150 cubic feet of split wood. Dutch's wife and 3 sons took turns waking every 2 hours to feed the fire. The family slept in shifts. By February, they looked like ghosts, exhausted, sick, defeated by the simple task of staying warm. Then Samuel made a decision that would mark him as either brilliant or insane. In the spring of 1878, he began stockpiling sandstone from a quarry site 12 miles upriver. Flat pieces, dense pieces, pieces that rang like bells when struck. He hauled them in a borrowed wagon, making the trip 11 times before the summer heat made the trail impassable. His neighbors watched with mild curiosity. Stone was normal. Everyone used stone for hearths and chimneys. But when Samuel started laying out the foundation in July, the curiosity turned to confusion. He wasn't building 1 chimney. He was building 4. Not 4 separate structures. 1 massive central column with 4 distinct flues spiraling through a shared thermal core. The base measured 8 feet by 8 feet. The stone walls, 2 feet thick. 4 fireboxes, 1 facing each cardinal direction, all feeding into the interlocking passages that rose through the center of the cabin like the trunk of an enormous stone tree. It looked absurd. It looked wasteful. It looked like the project of a man who'd spent too many months alone in the woods. But Samuel understood something the standard approach missed entirely. Heat doesn't just rise, it radiates. Most cabins treated fire as a point source. You burned wood in one spot, and that spot got hot. The rest of the structure stayed cold because there was no mass to absorb, store, and redistribute the thermal energy. A standard stone fireplace weighs maybe 1,200 pounds. It heats up fast, cools down fast. It's a conduit, not a battery. Samuel's 4-way chimney would weigh over 11,000 pounds. 11,000 pounds of dense sandstone sitting in the dead center of his cabin, absorbing heat from 4 separate fires, radiating that warmth in every direction simultaneously. The valley had never seen anything like it. By August, the central column stood 9 feet tall, and the questions had become accusations. The design was precise. Each of the 4 fireboxes opened into a dedicated combustion chamber, deep, narrow, lined with firebrick salvage from an old smelter operation near Missoula. The chambers converged into a central thermal core where the smoke from all 4 fires mixed and rose through a carefully calculated system of internal flues. This wasn't guesswork. Samuel had drawn it out on plank boards using charcoal, worked the geometry, tested the angles with scaled models built from creek stones and mud. Each firebox sat 18 inches deep and 24 inches wide. The openings were positioned exactly 42 inches above the cabin floor, high enough to radiate heat outward at chest level, low enough to allow easy loading. The internal flues spiraled upward in a double helix pattern, forcing the hot gases to travel through nearly 30 feet of stone before exiting at the roof. Every inch of that journey transferred heat into the massive thermal core. The sandstone itself was the key. Samuel had tested different stones with a simple method. Heat them in a fire, pull them out, time how long they stayed warm. Granite cooled in minutes. Limestone held heat longer, but cracked under thermal stress. Sandstone, dense, fine-grained sandstone from the river quarry, stayed warm for hours and handled repeated heating cycles without fracturing. The central mass would act as a 5.5-ton battery, storing thermal energy and releasing it gradually, evenly, relentlessly. But to the experienced builders in Bitterroot Valley, this design was insanity. First problem, fire risk. You're putting 4 fires in the center of a log cabin? Martin Cullens, a stonemason who'd built 19 hearths in the territory, stood at the construction site, shaking his head. One spark drops wrong, and you've got flame coming at you from 4 directions. There's no escape. You'll roast your family alive. The concern wasn't entirely unreasonable. Fire was the frontier's greatest terror. Cabins burned fast, pitch-heavy pine logs, dry-split shingles, animal fat candles, kerosene lamps. A standard fireplace at least confined the risk to 1 wall. You could fight it, smother it, run from it. But 4 fireboxes in the center? That felt like courting disaster. Second problem, structural insanity. That's 11,000 pounds sitting on your floor joists, said William Durner, a carpenter who'd framed 60 structures across Montana territory. Your foundation logs will crack. The whole center of the cabin will sag. By next spring, you'll have a chimney poking through a collapsed roof and a floor tilted like a drunk man's barn. Standard cabins distributed weight along the perimeter walls. The center stayed open, light, unencumbered. Samuel's design inverted that logic entirely. He'd reinforced the foundation with a grid of cross-laid logs, each one 18 inches in diameter, treated with a mixture of ash and clay to resist rot. Beneath that, he'd excavated 30 inches down and filled the pit with compacted river rock for drainage and stability. But the critics weren't interested in his calculations. Third problem, cost and labor. You hauled 11 wagon loads of stone for 1 chimney. Dutch Kerner asked, watching Samuel mortar another course into place. I built my whole cabin, walls, roof, floor, and fireplace, with less effort than you're putting into this monument. What are you trying to prove? That you're tougher than winter? The timeline supported Dutch's skepticism. A standard fireplace took 2 men 3 days to build. Samuel had been working alone for 6 weeks, and he wasn't done. The mortar alone, a mix of river clay, sand, and lime he'd burned from crushed limestone, required constant preparation. Every stone had to be selected, shaped, test-fitted. The internal flues had to align perfectly, or the draft would fail and smoke would pour back into the cabin. And then there was the social judgment. That's not a cabin, muttered Agnes Hoffman, the valley's unofficial arbiter of domestic respectability. It's a pagan temple. For fires like some kind of heathen ritual. A proper Christian home has 1 hearth, 1 fire, 1 family gathered around it. What's Samuel's building? That's pride. That's vanity. That's a man too afraid of a little cold to face winter, like his neighbors. The criticism stung because it carried social weight. Frontier communities relied on shared norms. You built like everyone else built. You heated like everyone else heated. Deviation suggested distrust, superiority, a rejection of the collective wisdom. But Samuel kept building. He installed iron dampers in each firebox, hand-forged by a blacksmith in Stevensville, expensive, precise. The dampers allowed him to control airflow independently in each combustion chamber. Close one, and that side drew less oxygen. Open all four, and the central core roared like a blast furnace. He lined the interior passages with smooth, tightly fitted stones to minimize turbulence and creosote buildup. He angled the flue exits to prevent downdrafts. He built inspection ports into two sides of the column, so he could clean the passages every season without disassembling the structure. Every detail had a reason. Every choice solved a problem. The four-way design eliminated cold corners because heat radiated from the center outward in all directions simultaneously. The massive thermal mass meant the cabin would stay warm for hours, maybe 6, maybe 8, after the fires died down, reducing the need for constant refueling. The independent fireboxes allowed Samuel to burn only what he needed. 1 fire for a mild day, 2 for moderate cold, all 4 for deep winter. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't vanity. It was engineering born from 4 winters of suffering and 1 summer of relentless calculation. But as the leaves turned gold and the first cold winds swept down from the bitterroots, the valley wasn't convinced. They'd seen ambitious projects before. They'd seen men overreach, fail, freeze. And they were certain Samuel Bridger had just built the most expensive mistake in Montana territory. October 18th, 1878. The Bitterroot Grange Hall. Every fall, the valley settlers gathered to share harvest reports, trade goods, and settle disputes before winter isolation set in. This year, Samuel's chimney became the unscheduled main event. Martin Cullens stood near the potbelly stove, holding court with a cluster of men who'd built most of the structures in the surrounding 50 miles. He didn't wait for Samuel to arrive before launching his assessment. That 4-way monstrosity is a death trap. His voice carried across the hall. Conversations stopped. Women looked up from their sewing circles. Children froze mid-game. I've built stone fireplaces from here to Fort Benton. Martin continued, his weathered hands gesturing like a preacher at a pulpit. I know fire. I know draft. I know what happens when you try to get cute with combustion. And what Samuel Bridger built, that's not innovation. That's a suicide pact. The crowd leaned in. 4 fires in the center of a cabin means 4 separate heat sources for separate drafts, for separate ways for things to go wrong. You get a backdraft in one flue, and smoke pours into the living space from all sides. You can't escape it. You can't fight it. You just suffocate. Someone muttered agreement. A few heads nodded. And the weight. Martin's voice rose. 11,000 pounds sitting on floor joists? I get 1 winter. Maybe 2. Then the center sags, the chimney cracks, and the whole structure becomes kindling. You want to know what happens when a stone column collapses inside a burning cabin? Ask the widow in Deer Lodge. She'll tell you. He wasn't finished. But here's the real problem. The problem nobody's saying out loud. Martin looked around the room, making eye contact with the assembled settlers. A man who builds something that complicated, that different, that expensive, what's he really saying? He's saying the rest of us are fools. He's saying our cabins aren't good enough. He's saying he's smarter than every logger, every builder, every family that came before him. The social accusation hit harder than the technical critique. William Durner, the carpenter, stepped forward. His reputation was quieter than Martin's, but his opinion carried weight. He'd framed structures in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and now Montana. He understood wood and load and time. It's going to fail structurally, Williams said flatly. Not might. Will. I've seen what happens when you overload a floor system. The joists flex, the connections loosen, the whole thing starts moving. And once it starts moving, it doesn't stop. You get gaps between logs. Wind whistles through. Moisture gets in. The rot spreads. He pointed toward the door, in the general direction of Samuel's property. By spring thaw, that cabin's going to look like a broken-backed mule. And by next fall, Samuel will be tearing the whole thing down and starting over, if he's lucky. If he's not lucky, he'll be pulling his family out of the rubble in the middle of a January blizzard. The women weren't silent either. Agnes Hoffman stood, her thin frame radiating moral certainty. "I've kept a home for 32 years, she said. Raised 6 children. Buried 2. I know what a family needs, and it's not some fortress in the middle of the room taking up half the living space." She smoothed her apron, gathering momentum. A proper home has room to move, room to work, room for children to play, and women to cook, and men to mend tools by the fire. What Samuel's built, it's a shrine to his own cleverness. It's selfish, it's impractical, and it's not how decent people live. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but everyone heard it. A real man doesn't need 4 fires to keep his family warm. He needs 1 fire, a strong back, and the will to face winter like his father did and his father before him. What Samuel's doing, that's not strength. That's fear. That's a man so terrified of a little cold that he'll waste half his summer building a stone castle while his neighbors are cutting hay and storing food. The judgment was complete. Dangerous, wasteful, arrogant, weak. When Samuel finally arrived, late, still covered in mortar dust, the room fell silent. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the atmosphere, understanding exactly what had been said. Martin Cullens broke the silence. "You planning to explain the thing you built, Samuel? Or are you just going to let it speak for itself come January?" Samuel met his gaze. "It'll speak for itself." He didn't defend the design, didn't argue the physics, didn't point out that Martin's own chimney smoked so badly his family ate supper outside until November. He just nodded once and walked to the back of the hall. The message was clear: wait for winter. Then we'll see who's right. But as October faded into November and the first hard frost settled over Bitterroot Valley, the consensus remained firm. Samuel Bridger had built an expensive, complicated failure. The only question was whether it would collapse, catch fire, or simply prove too inefficient to matter. No one, absolutely no one, expected what was coming. November 1878 started cold. By December, it had become something else entirely. The first blizzard hit on December 8th, a Sunday. It came down from Canada, a rolling wall of gray that swallowed the mountains and kept moving. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit in 6 hours. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 20 feet. Wind howled through the valley like something alive and angry. By Monday morning, the Bitterroot Valley was buried under 19 inches of new snow, and the temperature was still falling. Standard cabins, built according to tradition, according to collective wisdom, struggled immediately. Dutch Kerner's family woke to frost on the inside walls. His single fireplace, that good, reliable stone hearth everyone approved of, couldn't push heat more than 8 feet from the firebox. The northwest and northeast corners of his cabin dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit. His youngest son, just 4 years old, developed a wet cough by Tuesday. His wife moved all 3 boys into the main room, piling every blanket they owned into a makeshift nest near the fire. Dutch fed that fire constantly, every 2 hours, day and night. He burned through half a cord of wood in the first 3 days. The Hoffman cabin, 15 feet longer than Dutch's, fared worse. Agnes's husband, Robert, had built their fireplace on the south wall. Standard practice, meant to catch winter sun through the windows and amplify the warmth. But with the blizzard blocking the sun and wind screaming down from the north, the back half of their cabin became uninhabitable. By Wednesday, they'd abandoned the sleeping loft entirely. Ice formed on the ladder rungs. The water bucket near the north wall froze solid despite being indoors. Agnes cooked in shifts, retreating to the fire between tasks because her hands went numb after 5 minutes at the work table. And the wood. God, the wood. Everyone had stockpiled firewood, cord upon cords of split pine and fir, stacked under lean-tos and covered with canvas. But December's cold made everything harder. The wood was frozen, sometimes coated in ice. It took longer to catch, produced less heat, smoked more. Men hauled load after load from the woodsheds to the cabins, fighting through snow that deepened by the hour. Dutch calculated it grimly on Thursday night. At this rate, he'd burn through his entire winter supply by early February. Then what? Cut and split frozen wood in sub-zero temperatures? Burn green wood and choke the family with smoke? By Friday, December 13th, the community was in trouble. The temperature hadn't risen above zero in 6 days. Martin Cullins's Chimney, that expert construction, 19 successful installations across the territory, developed a draft problem. Cold air sank down through the flue at night when the fire died low, pushing smoke back into the cabin. His wife woke coughing, gasping, opening the door to clear the air and letting in 10 degrees Fahrenheit gusts that dropped the interior temperature by 20 degrees in minutes. William Durner's carefully framed cabin settled under the snow load. Not catastrophically, just enough to open gaps between the logs. Wind found every crack. His family stuffed the gaps with rags, moss, old clothing. It helped, but not enough. The valley's children suffered most. Wet coughs turned to fever. Fevers turned to pneumonia in the poorly heated sleeping lofts and cold corners where families had been pushed by inadequate heating systems. Dr. Morrison from Stevensville made the rounds when he could, but the trails were impassable more often than not. And then, on December 15th, something broke. The Hendricks family, newcomers who'd arrived in September and built fast to beat winter, lost their chimney. A structural crack, exactly the kind William Durner warned about, opened in the mortar during a thermal cycle. Cold stone, hot fire, cold again. Expansion, contraction, failure. Smoke poured into their cabin at 2 a.m. They evacuated into the blizzard wearing whatever they'd slept in. The father, James Hendricks, tried to fight the smoke with wet blankets while his wife and 2 daughters huddled in the lee of the woodshed. They survived. Barely. Dutch Kerner took them in, crowding 9 people into a space meant for 5, feeding an already desperate fire with what he couldn't afford to spare. The valley was breaking. And through it all, through every frozen morning and desperate night, through every conversation about failing chimneys and dwindling woodpiles and sick children, one question kept surfacing. How's Samuel doing? Not out of concern. Not really. Out of grim anticipation. The valley wanted vindication. They wanted proof that the 4-way chimney was the disaster they predicted. They wanted Samuel Bridger to come crawling back, asking to winter at someone else's hearth, admitting his expensive mistake. But Samuel wasn't coming. His cabin stood silent at the north end of the valley, smoke rising from the central column in 4 thin streams that merged and dissipated into the storm. No one had visited. The snow was too deep, the cold too bitter. But from a distance, in the brief moments when the blizzard cleared, settlers could see Samuel's property. And something was wrong. Not wrong like failure. Wrong like difference. Samuel's woodpile was barely touched. His chimney wasn't smoking like the others. No thick black plumes. No signs of desperate overfeeding. Just those 4 thin streams, steady and controlled. On December 16th, Martin Cullins couldn't stand it anymore. He strapped on snowshoes, wrapped himself in every piece of wool he owned, and made the 2-mile trek to Samuel's cabin. Partly to check if the man was still alive. Partly to confirm the failure everyone expected. But mostly because he needed to know why Samuel's firewood pile was still full. Martin Cullins reached Samuel's cabin at 11:47 a.m., December 16th, 1878. The snowshoes had kept him on top of the drifts, but the 2-mile journey had taken 90 minutes. His beard was crusted with ice. His lungs burned from breathing sub-zero air. He was exhausted, cold, and certain he'd find Samuel either dead or huddled in a smoke-filled disaster. What he found instead made him stop at the property line and stare. Samuel was outside, not bundled in every piece of clothing he owned, not desperately splitting frozen wood, not fighting to keep a failing system alive. He was working, calmly, methodically, repairing a section of fence that the snow had damaged. He wore a wool coat? Yes, but it was unbuttoned. His hands were bare. In -8 degrees Fahrenheit weather, Samuel Bridger was working outside without gloves. Martin. Samuel looked up, showing no surprise at the visitor. Rough walk. Martin couldn't answer immediately. He He was staring past Samuel at the cabin itself. For thin streams of smoke rose from the central chimney, barely visible, like breath on a cold morning. Not the thick black plumes that marked every other cabin in the valley. Not the desperate overfeeding that characterized a failing heating system. Just 4 calm, steady exhales of smoke. "Your fire's out?" Martin finally managed. "No." Samuel set down the fence rail he'd been positioning. "Come inside. Warm up." The door opened, and heat rolled out like a physical presence. Martin stepped through into a wall of warmth so immediate, so encompassing, that he actually gasped. For 6 days, he'd lived in a cabin where you could see your breath 8 feet for the fireplace, where children wore coats indoors, where ice formed on the walls. Samuel's cabin was 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Not near the fire, not in one warm corner. Everywhere. Martin walked to the northwest corner, the death zone in his own cabin, the place where cold concentrated and nothing could drive it out. He held up his hand. Warm. Comfortably, evenly warm. The 4-way chimney dominated the center of the space, its sandstone mass radiating heat like a gentle sun. But here's what made Martin's throat tighten. Only 2 of the 4 fireboxes were burning. 2 small fires. He could see through the openings. Nothing dramatic, nothing excessive. Just 2 modest blazes feeding into that massive thermal core. And the entire cabin was warmer than Martin's had been, with a roaring fire consuming wood at 3 times the rate. "Ow!" Martin walked around the column, touching the stone. Hot, but not burning. Radiating. "How long have those fires been going?" "Started them this morning around 6, Samuel said, hanging his coat on a peg. "I'll bank them around 9 tonight. Won't need to touch them again until tomorrow morning." 15 hours of heating from 2 small fires. Martin did the math instinctively. In his cabin, he fed the fire every 2 hours, day and night. Samuel was running 2 fires for 15 hours and then letting them die. The thermal mass, that 11,000 pounds of sandstone, would hold the heat through the night. "What's your wood consumption?" Martin asked, his voice hoarse. Samuel walked to a rough table and picked up a piece of paper covered in careful notations. "I've been tracking it since December 1st. Average daily consumption, 43 pounds of split pine and fir. That's running 2 to 3 fires, depending on outside temperature. Yesterday, when it hit minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, I ran all 4 fires for 6 hours, then banked them. Consumed 61 pounds total." Martin's hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. He was burning approximately 220 pounds of wood per day to keep his family barely comfortable. Samuel was using less than a third of that and achieving temperatures Martin couldn't reach, even during his most desperate overfeeding. "The corners," Martin said, walking to each one, holding up his hand like a man testing for ghosts. "They're all the same temperature." "Within 3 degrees, Samuel confirmed. "The central mass radiates in all directions simultaneously. No cold spots. No dead zones. The heat distributes itself naturally through convection and radiation." Martin found himself standing at the sleeping loft ladder. In his cabin, the loft was abandoned, too cold, too dangerous for children. He climbed up. The loft was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm air rises. Samuel had understood that, designed for it. The heat from his central column climbed naturally into the upper space, making the sleeping area the place where families were most vulnerable during long winter nights. Not just habitable, but comfortable. Martin came back down the ladder, slowly. "Your family," he said. "Where are they?" "My wife took the girls to Stevensville yesterday, visiting her sister. They'll be back next week." Samuel poured coffee from a pot sitting on a small warming shelf built into the south-facing firebox. The coffee was hot. Not lukewarm, not reheated. Actually hot, maintained at temperature by radiant heat from the stone. He handed Martin a cup. "I heard about the Hendricks family," Samuel said quietly. "Their chimney failed." "It did. And I heard Dutch is burning through his wood supply twice as fast as he planned." "He is." Martin sat down heavily on a bench near the column. The stone warmed his back through his coat. He'd come here expecting vindication, proof that the complicated, expensive, controversial design had failed. proof that tradition and collective wisdom had been right. Instead, he was sitting in the most efficiently heated structure he'd ever experienced. The draft, Martin said, grasping for technical critique. 4 separate fireboxes for separate drafts. That should create backdraft problems, smoke intrusion, combustion failure. Samuel set down his coffee and walked to the column. He adjusted a damper on the east firebox, a simple iron lever connected to an internal gate. Independent control, Samuel explained. Each firebox can be adjusted separately. If one side starts drawing too hard or too soft, I compensate. The flues spiral through the core. They don't fight each other. They work together. The hot gases mix in the central chamber, creating a unified updraft that's actually stronger and more stable than a single flue. Martin had built 19 chimneys. He understood draft, understood combustion, understood the physics of smoke and heat. And Samuel was right. The design didn't violate the principles. It optimized them. How long does the heat last? Martin asked. After the fires die. I ran a test on December 9th, Samuel said, returning to his notes. Let all 4 fires burn out completely at 10 p.m., recorded internal temperature every hour through the night. At 6 a.m., 8 hours later, the cabin was still 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal mass releases heat for approximately 10 to 12 hours after the fires die, depending on outside temperature. 10 to 12 hours. Martin's cabin dropped below freezing in 2 hours if the fire went out. Samuel's cabin stayed livable through an entire winter night with 0 active combustion. The weight, Martin said, his final objection sounding hollow even as he spoke it. The structural load. That's going to fail. Samuel stomped on the floor. Solid. No flex, no give, no settling. The foundation logs are cross-laid and 18 inches thick. The stone sits on compacted river rock over 30 inches of excavation. The load is distributed across 16 feet of bearing surface. It's not going anywhere. Martin sat in silence for 5 full minutes. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the 2 fires and the wind outside. But inside it was warm, stable, peaceful. No desperate stoking. No constant anxiety about wood consumption. No frozen children in cold corners. Just heat. Even reliable, efficient heat. How much would you have left? Martin finally asked. Samuel walked to the door and pointed toward his woodshed. I stacked 9 cords in October. Based on current consumption, I'll finish winter with approximately 4 cords remaining. Maybe 5 if we get a mild February. Martin had started winter with 11 cords. He'd already burned through 4, and it was only mid-December. The math was devastating. Samuel would use 5 cords to heat his cabin through the entire winter, comfortably, safely, efficiently. Martin would burn 11 or 12 cords and still have his family sleeping in shifts, huddled near a single inadequate fire, praying for spring. You knew, Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper. You knew this would work. I calculated it would work, Samuel corrected. But I didn't know. Not for certain. Not until the cold came. Martin stood up, setting down the coffee cup. His mind was racing. Every criticism he'd leveled at the Grange Hall, every technical objection, every structural concern, every social judgment, all of it was collapsing under the weight of empirical reality. The 4-way chimney wasn't a death trap. It was the safest heating system in the valley. No smoke intrusion, no backdraft, no structural stress. It wasn't wasteful. It was the most efficient design anyone had ever built. It wasn't arrogant. It was humble, practical problem-solving born from observation and calculation. I need to go, Martin said. Samuel nodded. Travel safe. Storm's supposed to break tomorrow. Martin walked to the door, paused, turned back. I said things. At the Grange Hall. I said your design was going to kill your family. I remember. I was wrong. Samuel met his eyes. You were protecting the community with the knowledge you had. Can't fault a man for that. But Martin could fault himself. And he did. All the way back through the snow to his cold, inefficient cabin. The storm broke on December 17th, and word spread like meltwater. Martin Cullens didn't hide what he'd seen. He told his wife first, showed her the numbers he'd written down, explained the temperature differential, admitted the magnitude of his mistake. Then he told William Durner, then Dutch Kerner, then anyone who would listen. Samuel's cabin is 71 degrees with 2 small fires. Mine is 48 degrees with a fire I'm feeding every 2 hours. The numbers were irrefutable. The comparison was humiliating, and Martin didn't soften it. By December 20th, a line of visitors had formed at Samuel's property. Skeptics wanting to see for themselves. Families desperate for solutions. Builders trying to understand the engineering. Everyone came away shaking their heads, not in disbelief at failure, but in astonishment at success. Dutch Kerner came on December 21st with his 3 sons. Samuel showed them everything: the firebox design, the internal flue system, the damper controls, the thermal mass calculations. He let them measure the temperature in every corner. He showed them his wood consumption logs. He explained the physics in plain language. Mass absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, creating stability where standard fireplaces create peaks and valleys. How much did this cost? Dutch asked, running his hand along the sandstone. Stone was free, just labor to haul it. Mortar materials, maybe $8. Iron dampers, $15 from the blacksmith. Call it $25 total, plus 6 weeks of work. Dutch was burning $25 worth of extra firewood every month, trying to keep his family warm. The 4-way chimney would pay for itself before February. Can you help me build one? Dutch asked, and there it was. The turn. Samuel didn't gloat, didn't remind Dutch of the criticism, the mockery, the social judgment. He just nodded. We'll start in spring. Stone's too frozen to work with now, and you need your cabin this winter. But yes, I'll help you. By Christmas, the social dynamic had completely inverted. Agnes Hoffman, who'd called the design a pagan temple and questioned Samuel's manhood, came with her husband Robert. She didn't apologize. Agnes Hoffman didn't apologize, but she asked questions. Technical questions. About cooking surfaces, about clearance from combustibles, about maintenance schedules. Samuel answered every question patiently, demonstrating how the warming shells on each firebox could keep food hot, how the mass prevented dangerous temperature spikes, how the design actually reduced fire risk because combustion was controlled and stable. How many fires do you run when you're cooking? Agnes asked. Usually 2. South and West boxes. The South box has the best warming shelf, and the West box has the highest clearance for pot hooks. I can cook for 6 people comfortably with less fuel than a standard fireplace uses to boil water. Agnes looked at her husband. Robert looked at the floor. They'd come prepared to find a compromise, a way to save face while acknowledging Samuel had achieved something. Instead, they'd found undeniable superiority in every measurable category. William Durner arrived on December 27th. He was the structural critic, the man who'd predicted catastrophic failure, collapsing floors, broken back cabins. He carried a carpenter's level and a plumb line. Samuel let him inspect everything. William checked the foundation logs. No cracking, no settling, no deflection. He checked the floor joists beneath the stone mass. No sagging, no stress fractures. The cross-laid foundation distributed the load exactly as designed. He plumbed the chimney column, perfectly vertical. No lean, no shift, no indication of structural movement. The load calculations, William said, sitting down to review Samuel's original drawings. You figured all this before you built? Had to. 11,000 pounds isn't something you guess about. William studied the diagrams, the bearing surface calculations, the load distribution patterns, the foundation depth specifications. It was better engineering than William had seen in professionally designed structures. And Samuel had done alone, with charcoal sketches on scrap lumber. I told everyone this would collapse by spring, William said quietly. I know, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Samuel looked at him steadily. You were doing your job, protecting people from bad construction. Nothing wrong with that. But it wasn't bad construction. No, it wasn't. William packed up his tools. When Dutch builds his, I'll frame it for free. Least I can do. By January 1879, the adoption had begun. Samuel wasn't pushing it. He wasn't evangelizing. But every family that visited came away with the same realization. The four-way chimney solved problems they'd accepted as inevitable. Cold corners, sick children, exhausted parents feeding fires through the night, depleted wood supplies, structural risks from overheated single-point sources. The design addressed everything. And it wasn't theoretical. It was empirical, tested by the coldest December in recorded memory. The Bitterroot Grange Hall meeting on January 15, 1879, was entirely different from the October gathering. Martin Cullen stood in the same spot near the potbelly stove, but his message had changed. "I inspected Samuel Bridger's four-way chimney system," Martin announced. "I measured temperatures, tracked wood consumption, checked draft efficiency, and examined structural integrity. I'm here to tell you, it's the best heating system I've ever seen. Period." The room was silent, but it wasn't hostile. It was attentive. Anyone planning construction this spring should consider this design seriously. Agnes Hoffman raised her hand. "Is it safe?" Martin nodded. "Safer than a standard fireplace. The thermal mass prevents temperature spikes. The independent dampers allow precise control. The central location eliminates exterior wall penetrations. And the stone's so thick, you'd have to try pretty hard to set something on fire." "Is it complicated to maintain?" someone else asked. "No more than a standard chimney. Actually simpler in some ways. The inspection ports let you clean the flues without tearing anything apart." The questions continued for 20 minutes. By the end, 4 families had committed to building four-way systems before next winter. 5 more were seriously considering it. Dutch Kerner stood up. "Samuel taught me something. He taught me that just because we've always done something one way doesn't mean it's the right way. We copied our cabin designs from the East, from places with different winters, different wood supplies, different needs. Samuel looked at our actual situation, our wood, our weather, our resources, and designed for reality instead of tradition. He looked around the room. That's not arrogance. That's intelligence. And we should be grateful someone in this valley had the brains and the guts to try something new." The room erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Genuine, sustained applause. For a man who'd been mocked, criticized, and socially judged just 3 months earlier. Samuel wasn't at the meeting. He was home with his family, his cabin comfortably warm with 2 small fires, using a fraction of the wood his neighbors were burning. But the message was clear. The valley had changed its mind. By late spring 1879, construction had begun on 17 four-way chimney systems within 50 miles of Samuel's cabin. Some were exact copies. Others were adaptations. 3-way systems for smaller cabins, 5-way systems for larger structures, variations in stone type and firebox placement based on local materials and needs. The innovation had become tradition. Martin Cullens, who'd called it a death trap, was now the primary builder of 4-way systems. He learned from Samuel, adapted the techniques, and was charging fair prices to install them across the territory. William Durner framed the structures for free, as promised, then started charging because demand outstripped charity. Agnes Hoffman's husband Robert built one in their cabin. Agnes never apologized, but she did bake Samuel a rhubarb pie and delivered it without comment. By winter 1879 to 1880, the Bitterroot Valley had become known across Montana Territory as the Warm Valley, the place where settlers had figured out how to heat their cabins efficiently, how to survive deep winter without burning through all their wood, how to keep their children healthy and their families comfortable. And everyone knew it started with Samuel Bridger's four-way chimney. Understanding why the four-way chimney succeeded requires understanding what standard fireplaces got wrong. A traditional frontier fireplace was a heat broadcaster. It generated thermal energy in one location and tried to push that energy outward through radiation and convection. But heat dissipates rapidly. The inverse square law applies. Double the distance from the fire, and you receive only 1/4 the radiant heat. This is why frontier families huddled close to their hearths. 8 feet away, the warmth dropped dramatically. 12 feet away, you might as well be outside. The corners farthest from the fireplace became cold zones, places where temperature differentials created discomfort, condensation, and health risks. And the thermal mass of a standard fireplace, 1,200 to 1,800 pounds of stone, was insufficient for meaningful heat storage. It heated quickly when the fire burned, cooled quickly when the fire died. The cabin's temperature graph looked like a heartbeat. Spike, drop, spike, drop. Samuel's design inverted this entire paradigm. Instead of a point source radiating outward, he created a central battery. The 11,000-pound sandstone mass absorbed thermal energy from 4 separate combustion sources simultaneously. That mass, that enormous thermal capacitor, stabilized the temperature completely. Think of it this way. A standard fireplace is like a light bulb. Turn it on, and it's bright. Turn it off, and it's dark instantly. Samuel's 4-way chimney was like a massive storage battery being charged by 4 separate inputs. Turn off the inputs, and the battery still produces light for hours. The physics are straightforward once you examine them. Sandstone has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That means raising 1 pound of sandstone by 1 degree requires 0.22 BTUs of energy. Samuel's 11,000-pound mass required 2,420 BTUs to increase its temperature by just 1 degree. But flip that around. Once heated, that mass released 2,420 BTUs when it cooled by 1 degree. Heat the entire structure from 70 degrees Fahrenheit to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, a typical operating range, and you stored 193,600 BTUs. That's enough energy to keep the cabin warm for 8 to 12 hours with zero active combustion. Standard fireplaces couldn't match that because they lacked the mass. But mass alone wasn't enough. Samuel's genius was in the heat distribution geometry. The central location meant radiant heat traveled outward in all directions simultaneously. No matter where you stood in the cabin, you were approximately the same distance from the thermal mass. Northwest corner, 12 feet from the column. Southeast corner, 12 feet from the column. The inverse square law still applied, but it applied equally in all directions. Contrast this with a perimeter fireplace. The near side is 8 feet away. The far side is 24 feet away. That's a 9-fold difference in received radiant heat. Samuel eliminated that inequality completely. The 4-way firebox arrangement also solved a subtler problem: combustion air supply and exhaust. In a standard fireplace, cold air enters the cabin, gets heated, rises up the chimney, and exits. This creates negative pressure. The cabin is constantly pulling in cold outside air to replace the warm air being lost. The fire literally sucks warmth out of the living space. Samuel's design minimized this. The 4 separate fireboxes could be operated independently. Need minimal heat? Run one fire at low intensity. The draft is reduced, the air exchange is reduced, the heat loss is reduced. Need maximum heat? Run all 4 fires. The increased thermal output compensates for the increased air exchange. And because the flues spiraled through 30 feet of stone before exiting, every foot of travel transferred heat into the mass. The smoke that exited Samuel's chimney was significantly cooler than smoke from a standard fireplace, proof that more thermal energy was being captured and retained rather than vented uselessly to the atmosphere. The internal flue geometry was critical. Samuel had designed a double helix pattern. 2 flues spiral clockwise, 2 counterclockwise. They never intersected, never created turbulence, never fought each other for draft. But they shared the thermal mass intimately. Hot gases from all 4 fires heated the same central core, creating a unified thermal reservoir. This is why the stone reached such high temperatures, 150 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, potentially 200 degrees Fahrenheit in the core. For sources of heat, all contributing to one mass. The surface area of the column was also optimized. A standard fireplace presents perhaps 15 square feet of hot surface to the living space. Samuel's column presented approximately 80 square feet, every face of the 8 by 8 foot structure. More surface area meant more radiant heat transfer. And because the column stood free in the center of the cabin, air could circulate completely around it. Natural convection, hot air rising, cool air sinking, created a gentle circulation pattern that distributed warmth evenly throughout the interior. You could see this on cold mornings. Put a candle on the floor near the column. The flame would lean inward as cool air flowed toward the heat source. Put a candle at ceiling height. The flame would lean outward as warm air radiated from the stone. The cabin was a self-regulating convection system with the thermal mass as the engine. The firebox design itself showed careful thought. Each box was 18 inches deep enough to create efficient combustion with minimal smoke. The openings were 24 inches wide enough to load substantial pieces of wood, narrow enough to maintain draft velocity. The height above the floor, 42 inches, positioned the radiant heat at chest level for maximum comfort, and the firebrick linings protected the sandstone from direct flame contact. Sandstone is durable, but sustained direct exposure to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit flames would eventually cause spalling and degradation. The firebrick took that abuse, leaving the sandstone to do what it did best: absorb, store, and radiate moderate heat. The damper controls gave Samuel something no standard fireplace offered: precision. He could tune each firebox independently based on wind direction, outside temperature, and desired interior warmth. North wind blowing hard. Close the north damper partially to prevent backdraft. Mild day. Run one fire at minimum draft. Brutal cold. Open all 4 dampers and let the system reach maximum output. This control translated directly to efficiency. Standard fireplaces operated in binary: fire or no fire. Samuel's system operated on a spectrum, matching thermal output to actual need rather than overshooting and wasting fuel. The maintenance advantages were equally significant. Standard chimneys accumulated creosote in hard-to-reach places. Cleaning required either dangerous roof work or complete disassembly. Samuel's inspection ports, simple stone panels that could be removed from inside the cabin, allowed access to every section of the flue system. He cleaned his chimney twice per heating season. The job took 2 hours and required no special tools. Compare that to the day-long ordeal of cleaning a standard chimney, often delayed until serious buildup created fire risk. The structural integrity that William Durner had questioned was actually enhanced by the design. The mass sat on a distributed foundation that was over-engineered by modern standards. The load was spread across 256 square feet of bearing surface. That's approximately 43 pounds per square foot, well within the capacity of properly laid foundation logs. And because the mass was symmetrical and centered, it created no lateral forces, no unbalanced loads, no stress concentrations. It just sat there, heavy and stable, doing its job year after year. The longevity proved remarkable. Samuel's original 4-way chimney operated for 43 years before requiring major maintenance. The sandstone developed some surface erosion. A few mortar joints needed repointing, but the core structure remained sound. 43 winters of thermal cycling, 43 years of use, and the system still functioned as designed. Compare that to standard fireplaces, which often needed rebuilding every 10 to 15 years due to mortar failure, stone cracking, and structural settling. The innovation wasn't magic. It was applied physics, careful material selection, and geometric optimization. Samuel had taken principles known to stonemasons and engineers for centuries: thermal mass, heat storage, convection, radiation, and combined them in a configuration optimized for frontier cabin heating. He hadn't invented new science. He'd applied existing science to a specific problem with remarkable success. And the results spoke for themselves. Warmer cabins, healthier families, reduced wood consumption, improved safety, and long-term structural reliability. The 4-way chimney wasn't just better than standard fireplaces. It was better in every measurable way. Samuel Bridger never claimed to have invented anything new. When visitors asked him where the idea came from, he'd shrug and say, "Just looked at what wasn't working and try to fix it." But the truth was deeper than simple problem-solving. Samuel understood something that frontier culture and modern culture often forgets. Efficiency isn't the same as tradition. And innovation isn't the same as rejection. The settlers who criticized Samuel's four-way chimney weren't stupid or malicious. They were following a pattern that had served humanity for thousands of years. Replicate what works, avoid what's unproven, stick with the collective wisdom. This approach keeps communities safe. It prevents disasters. It preserves knowledge across generations, but also creates blind spots. The standard fireplace design that Montana settlers imported from the East Coast had never been optimized for Montana conditions. It worked fine in Virginia, where winters were milder and wood was abundant. It worked acceptably in Ohio, where communities were denser and mutual support was easier. But in Montana Territory, where winter temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, where wood had to be hauled miles, where isolation made failure potentially fatal, the standard design was inadequate. No one questioned it because no one had permission to question it. You built like your father built. You heated like your neighbors heated. Deviation implied arrogance, distrust, or dangerous foolishness. Samuel's crime wasn't building a four-way chimney. His crime was thinking for himself. And when that independent thought produced results that exceeded tradition, it forced an uncomfortable recognition. Maybe collective wisdom isn't always wise. Maybe the old ways persist, not because they're optimal, but because they're familiar. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Inuit developed ice houses with carefully controlled ventilation that maintained stable interior temperatures despite being built from frozen water. European explorers thought they were primitive until they spent a winter in an Inuit snow house and realized it was warmer and more comfortable than their canvas tents and log structures. Japanese farmers developed the kotatsu, a low table with a heat source underneath and a blanket draped over it. That heated people directly rather than heating empty air. Europeans thought it was backwards until they calculated the energy efficiency and realized the kotatsu used 1/10 the fuel to achieve the same comfort. Russian settlers in Siberia developed the masonry heater, a massive stone or brick structure with internal channels that burned small, hot fires once or twice daily and radiated stored heat for 24 hours. German engineers thought it was impractical until they measured the fuel consumption and realized it was 3 to 5 times more efficient than cast iron stoves. These weren't primitive technologies. They were sophisticated engineering adapted to specific conditions. Samuel's four-way chimney fit this pattern perfectly. He'd looked at his actual situation, the available materials, the climate demands, the resource constraints, and designed a solution. Not a theoretical solution, not a fashionable solution, a functional solution. And when it worked, it revealed how much efficiency the standard approach had been sacrificing. The families who adopted four-way systems didn't just save wood. They saved time. Dutch Kerner went from waking every 2 hours to feed the fire to sleeping through the night. That's not a minor convenience. That's a transformation in quality of life. They saved health. The elimination of cold corners and temperature swings reduced respiratory illnesses among children. Dr. Morrison from Stevensville noted a measurable decline in winter pneumonia cases in cabins with four-way systems. They saved money. Less wood meant less labor, less wear on tools, less time away from other productive work. The initial investment in stone and construction paid for itself and reduced fuel costs within a single season. But perhaps most importantly, they saved anxiety. Frontier winters were brutal partly because of the cold itself, but also because of the constant fear of failure. What if the wood runs out? What if the chimney fails? What if the children get sick because the cabin's too cold? Samuel's design didn't eliminate winter, but it made winter manageable. And that shift from survival to competence is what defines the difference between coping with conditions and mastering them. The four-way chimneys spread across Montana Territory in the 1880s wasn't a fad. It was recognition of superiority. By 1885, an estimated 130 cabins had incorporated variations of Samuel's design. Some used 3 fireboxes instead of 4. Some used different stone types. Some added cooking features or water heating systems. But they all shared the core insight. central thermal mass with multiple combustion sources is more efficient than perimeter single-point heating. This knowledge didn't come from universities or engineering journals. It came from a logger who did calculations on scrap wood and tested his assumptions by building something people said would fail. That's the pattern of vernacular engineering. Practical innovation born from necessity and validated by results. Today, the principles Samuel demonstrated are standard in high-efficiency heating. Thermal mass storage, distributed combustion, convection optimization, heat recovery from exhaust gases. Modern masonry heaters, radiant floor systems, and high-mass passive solar designs all trace their lineage back to the same physics Samuel employed in 1878. But Samuel didn't have access to engineering textbooks or thermodynamic equations. He had cold children, limited resources, and a willingness to think differently. That willingness is the rarest and most valuable resource in any age. The settlers who mocked him at the Grange Hall weren't defending stupidity. They were defending safety through conformity. The builders who predicted structural failure weren't being malicious. They were protecting the community from unproven risk. But Samuel was proving that sometimes the greatest risk is refusing to question what everyone assumes is true. The four-way chimney stands as a reminder. Wisdom doesn't always wear the costume of tradition. Sometimes it wears work clothes and carries a trowel. Sometimes it draws diagrams on scrap lumber and hauls stone in a borrowed wagon. Sometimes it sits quiet while the experts criticize, then demonstrates truth through measurable results. And when truth emerges, the honest respond not with defensiveness, but with recognition. Martin Cullens became one of the most vocal advocates for four-way systems. He didn't hide his initial criticism. He acknowledged it openly and explained why he'd changed his position. I was wrong because I value my assumptions more than I valued observation. Samuel taught me to test assumptions against reality. That lesson, test assumptions against reality, is Samuel Bridger's true legacy. Not the chimney design itself, though it heated hundreds of cabins across Montana Territory for decades. Not the wood savings, though they were substantial and measurable. Not even the improved health outcomes, though they saved lives. The real legacy is the example of intellectual humility combined with practical boldness. Samuel wasn't arrogant enough to assume he was smarter than everyone else. But he wasn't timid enough to assume everyone else was necessarily right. He looked at the problem, designed a solution, built it carefully, and let the results speak. And the results spoke clearly. The old way wasn't the best way. It was just the familiar way. So here's the question Samuel Bridger's story poses to every generation. Which part of this solution would you apply today in your home? Not just the physical design. Though radiant mass heating is still one of the most efficient systems available. But the approach, the willingness to question, the courage to test, the humility to measure results honestly rather than defending assumptions stubbornly. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Because Samuel Bridger's four-way chimney wasn't just about staying warm in 1878 Montana. It was about the human capacity to observe, adapt, and improve. And that capacity doesn't have an expiration date. Note, this script is educational and historical in nature. Heating system design and construction should always follow local building codes and be performed by qualified professionals. The techniques described are presented for historical understanding, not as construction advice.